Now.
Okay.
So this morning, the title of my talk is Reflections from a Pottery Workshop. The past 3 days, I attended an intensive pottery workshop with 4 potters from Oaxaca, Mexico. It was a cultural exchange, and it was full of demonstrations and information about their unique methods of making pottery, alongside of learning about their lives and their really interesting artistic development as potters. And each of these 4 potters was an incredible potter. Each was very different, and each was an incredible potter and artist in their own right. The workshop was inspiring, it was challenging, and it was exhausting. So if I look exhausted or sound exhausted this morning, you're reading me right. I'm exhausted. But as usual, I find Dharma in the experiences of my life, and that's what I write Dharma talks about. And I have to say that today it would be close to impossible to write a Dharma talk about something other than this workshop, because the workshop was so absorbing, and it was sort of my life for the last 3 days. So, the very first demonstration we had on Sunday was about how to make very large pots, or somewhat large pots, in a traditional coil method. The potter was an indigenous potter, and she said this method of making pottery went back 5 generations in her family, but that she also combined it with modern techniques. She doesn't use tools at all. And I have piles of tools, but instead uses the knowledge and the strength of her hands and fingers to create large pots. Now, by the end of the day on Sunday, using my fingers, they were all locked. I couldn't move any of them because, they weren't strong enough, maybe, but also I didn't know how to manipulate my fingers quite right. Anyway, so being, wanting to learn this technique, set out to do what I thought she did, to do something similar. And very quickly, my pot collapsed, and I called her over for help. And she came over, and she just like took this knife, it's called a fettling knife in pottery, and she sliced right through both sides of this pot. And she like pulled it together and put all these coils around it. Whoa. Um, it looked like she was a miracle worker. Of course, this was not a miracle at all. This is often what we call miracles, is when we don't know how something works, we call it a miracle. So it appeared like a miracle to me. And she communicated with the help of a translator, because only one of the potters spoke English, that the reason my pot collapsed was my emotions. So Susan laughs out loud.
Sorry.
No, it was a little shocking like that. Yes. So my first go-to was, can I blame Donald Trump for my pot collapsing? So I knew that was a little overly simple. But then I like got a little widened that view a little bit. Or maybe it's because my pot collapsed because I really did feel intimidated being in this workshop with all of these professional potters. This was really out of my wheelhouse. Is that the expression? I think so. Anyway, so this potter, she described her pottery as a combination of ancient indigenous methods with modern techniques. Ah, that view that my pot was collapsing, that was a modern view. This is, I think, it's a psychological view. I know this view. That's my go-to a lot about my experience, that they are driven by emotions and by early childhood stuff. Oh, by the way, she also guided us in a meditation where we tried to remember our earliest, most awful childhood experience, not our earliest, our most awful childhood experience and our most positive one. So a lot of views about childhood and how childhood experiences come into, it turns out, pottery making. So it wasn't until later on that I questioned her view. Because, for one thing, once I understood her technique better, my next pot didn't collapse. Now, maybe my emotions were better. I was getting used to this workshop, and yeah, and I was so absorbed in pottery, I wasn't even thinking about Donald Trump. But I also think it was a little bit of her showing me what to do. But I began to see my collapsing pot in the way that I see things. Yes, there's some psychological in it, but it's really through the lens of conditionality. Yeah, my pot collapsed. I'd never done this before. And by the way, it was hard to see what she was doing and follow her demo because I was at the back of the room and I couldn't quite see the screen very well. Um, and I was not used to working in my hands this way. And by the way, it was a different clay body, so I wasn't used to the clay. And by the way, in general, I am not a quick study. I learn things, but I have to it takes me longer. And I also realized that this is how views work for me, especially when they're stated with certainty by someone who I really want to learn from. I take them up at first and consider how they apply to my experience, but then it's only later that I can go back and I can reflect upon them and I can question them. Now, as many of you know, views are very important from a Dharmic perspective, and reflecting upon our views is a strong feature of what we're doing here together. And it often entails taking up old views, views of how life works, views of how of ourself, many views, and then questioning them. Because again, when I better understood her technique, my next pot didn't collapse. So yesterday afternoon, at the end of the workshop, an organizer of the workshop and the exchange in general. I mean, she's done amazing things going to Oaxaca and connecting with this Oaxacan potters and making this whole thing happen. But she spoke up and reminded us of several things. But one was that though we might not consciously remember some of what we learned at this workshop, it might come back to us even years later when creating a pot. That too is how this meditation and this reflection works. Some of what we learn in our reflection and contemplation, yeah, we know it right away, and we maybe even it is affecting our life right then. But some of it takes time, maybe even years, to marinate and change our views and how we live our life. So I will end the Dharma talk with that thought, and I will leave you